When soldiers face the uncertainties of war, their minds often turn toward thoughts of death. They look for ways to find comfort for themselves and to comfort loved ones back home. Often they write letters of thanks and advice, encouraging their loved ones to carry on bravely and to live in ways that will bring them honor. Well, in many ways, Paul's epistle to the Philippians is like a letter to home from a soldier anticipating that he might die. Paul wrote Philippians at a time when he was suffering greatly, at a time when he wondered if he might soon be killed, and he wrote to people he loved. And so his words to the Christians in Philippi were heavy but caring, sad yet consoling, appreciative but bittersweet. From Paul's perspective, they could well have been his final words of advice and heartfelt thanks to his faithful friends. This is the 5th lesson in our series, Paul's Prison Epistles. And we have entitled this lesson, Paul and the Philippians, because we will be examining Paul's letter to the church in Philippi. In this letter, Paul wrote to encourage the Philippians who were worried about the sufferings he was enduring. As he anticipated the possibility that he might soon die, Paul wrote a letter of hope and encouragement for the times of persecution and distress he and the Philippians faced. We will divide our study of Paul and the Philippians into 3 parts. First, we will survey the background of Paul's letter to the Philippians. Second, we'll look closely at the structure and content of Philippians. And third, we will explore the modern application of this letter. Let's begin by looking at the background to Paul's letter to the Philippians. As we have said throughout this series, it's always important to know something about Paul's circumstances and those of the people to whom he wrote. Knowing these details helps us orient ourselves properly to Paul's message and to receive it as Paul intended. So, as we approach Paul's letter to the Philippians, we need to ask questions like, who were the Philippians? What was happening in their lives and in Paul's life? And why did Paul write to them? The answers to questions like these will help us to understand Paul's authoritative teaching in this letter and to apply it to our own lives. As we investigate the background to Paul's epistle to the Philippians, we will focus our attention on 3 matters. First, we will consider Paul's relationship with the Philippians. Second, we will mention some details of Paul's suffering in prison. And third, we will explore the conditions in Philippi at the time Paul wrote to them. Let's begin by looking at the relationship between Paul and the church in Philippi. Philippi was an important city in the Roman province of Macedonia, an area that now lies in modern Greece. It lay along the Via Egnatia, the main road connecting the city of Rome to the eastern provinces of its empire. And it possessed a special status with Rome, so that it had the same rights as a Roman colony in Italy, and even provided the citizens of Philippi with Roman citizenship. Paul had planted a church in Philippi during his second missionary journey, somewhere around the year AD 50. Before he reached Philippi, he had been ministering in Asia, but then he received a vision of a man begging him to bring the gospel to Macedonia. In response to this vision, Paul sailed for Macedonia, landing in Neapolis, but moving quickly inland to the city of Philippi, about 10 miles northwest of Neapolis. Many of Paul's activities in Philippi are recorded in Acts chapter 16, verses 12 through 40. For example, it was in Philippi that Paul gained his first convert in Europe, the merchant woman Lydia. And it was in Philippi that he was jailed for an exorcism he performed on a slave girl. This was also where the well-known Philippian jailer professed faith in Christ because he was so moved by Paul's compassion for him. Paul's ministry in Philippi was so successful that even when he left the city, the Philippian Christians supported Paul, sending him monetary gifts at various times when he was in financial need. Listen to Philippians chapter 4, verses 15 and 16, where Paul wrote about their generosity. When I set out from Macedonia, not one church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, except you only. For even when I was in Thessalonica, you sent me aid again and again when I was in need. The church in Philippi loved Paul, and they regularly helped him with financial gifts. According to Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 and 18, the Philippians also sent Paul a gift close to the time that he wrote his letter to them. Listen to Paul's words there. At last you have renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you have been concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I am amply supplied, now that I have received from Epaphroditus the gifts you sent. Although there were some Philippian believers who appeared to have been financially secure, the church as a whole was exceptionally poor, so they were not always able to help Paul financially. But when they had the opportunity, they gave to him generously. And just as the Philippians loved Paul, he felt strong affection for them as well. He loved them for their commitment to the Lord, and for the way they had been his partners in gospel ministry. They were his close friends, people whose fellowship he enjoyed and whose presence he missed. Listen to the way he spoke to them in Philippians chapter 1, verses 4 through 8. In all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. I have you in my heart. I long for all of you with the affection of Christ Jesus. In fact, in Philippians chapter 2, verse 12, and chapter 4, verse 1, Paul referred to the Philippians as his dear friends, using the Greek word agapetos. Agapetos is the term Paul commonly used to describe his closest co-workers and beloved friends, such as Tychicus, Epaphras, Philemon, Onesimus, and Luke. Paul's love for the Philippian church appears to have been more particular and specific than his love for many other churches, and it was manifested not only in feelings of belonging and familiarity, but also in a continuing, vibrant friendship. And this should not be surprising. After all, it isn't hard to imagine that there would be a close bond between Paul and Lydia, his hostess, or between Paul and the jailer whose life he saved, and perhaps even between Paul and the slave girl whom he rescued from demon possession. In all events, Paul had grown to love the believers in Philippi, and they had the same feelings toward him. Now that we have seen the caring, supportive relationship between Paul and the Philippians, we should turn to the details of the apostle's suffering in prison. What was Paul enduring at the time he wrote to the Philippians? Throughout his long ministry, Paul often suffered greatly. He was repeatedly whipped, beaten with rods, and hunted by assassins. He was imprisoned many times and once was even stoned and left for dead. And he did not always bear up well under these hardships. At times, he was depressed, even despairing. For instance, during his third missionary journey, he wrote these words in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8. We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about the hardships we suffered in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired even of life. Here, Paul described his feeling of being defeated, of temporarily losing hope because of the terrible conditions and circumstances he faced. Paul knew that life is never truly hopeless, that God is able to rescue us from any trouble. But he was also a human being. He had weaknesses just like ours. And the truth is that sometimes knowing and trusting in God's sovereignty doesn't keep us from despair. Even Paul struggled. Even Paul wanted to give up. Even Paul felt abandoned. And as we read the details of his epistle to the Philippians, it seems that he might have been struggling with similar feelings at the very time he wrote this letter. His theology anchored him in the truth, encouraged him that God was working for good even through suffering. But Paul's heart was still heavy, and his sorrow was profound. In his letter to the Philippians, Paul did not disclose all the troubles that weighed on his mind, but he did speak of some of them, and he revealed the collective impact all his troubles were having on his state of mind. For instance, he spoke frequently of death as a welcome relief from his suffering. For example, in Philippians chapter 3, verse 10, he wrote these words, "I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death." In this verse, Paul revealed that his present suffering was so great that his best hope for escape was death, and he saw his present sufferings as the means to his death. And in Philippians chapter 1, verse 20, Paul explained his perspective in this way, "I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now as always Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death." Paul lacked courage at this point, but he hoped that he would gain it before he was tested. His concern was to honor Christ, either by withstanding the test gracefully or by dying with dignity and resolve, not abandoning his confession of faith. And immediately after this, Paul expressed his desire to die with these words, "For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. I'm torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far." At the time he wrote this, Paul wanted to die. But usually he wanted to live and to preach, to carry the gospel to new places and peoples, to bring salvation to the world. Now, under normal circumstances, Christians should not want to die. Yes, at our deaths we will be with the Lord, and we should look forward to this, but not so much that we embrace death as a friend. We were created for life, and the scriptures teach that death is a curse. Paul himself called death an enemy in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 26. But at this point in Paul's life, his circumstances were so oppressive that the benefits of being with Christ outweighed his desire to continue in ministry, as well as his hatred for death itself. But Paul did not just imply his troubled state of mind through his desire for death. He also stated it explicitly in several different places. For example, in Philippians chapter 2, verses 27 and 28, he spoke of Epaphroditus' recovery from illness in these terms. "Epaphroditus was ill and almost died, but God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but also on me, to spare me sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore, I am all the more eager to send him, so that when you see him again, you may be glad, and I may have less anxiety." Epaphroditus' death would have added more sorrow to the sorrow Paul already felt. And even though Epaphroditus' return to Philippi would reduce Paul's anxiety, it would not eliminate it. Perhaps the best explanation for Paul's sorrow and anxiety, and for his statements about death, is that at this point his life was in serious jeopardy. As we saw in a prior lesson, he may have written this letter from Rome or from Caesarea Maritima. If he wrote from Rome, it may be that he expected Caesar to condemn him. And if he wrote from Caesarea Maritima, He may have been worried about the Jewish plan to assassinate him. But whatever the impending threat, Paul seems to have been contemplating the real possibility that he would die soon. For instance, in Philippians chapter 1, verse 20, he wrote hopefully, "Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death." And in chapter 1, verse 22, he indicated that he might have a choice of dying, writing, "If I am to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me, yet what shall I choose?" In chapter 2, verse 17, he spoke of the possibility that he was being poured out like a drink offering. And in chapter 3, verse 10, he suggested that his current sharing in the sufferings of Christ might well lead to Paul becoming like Christ in his death. But Paul was not absolutely convinced that he would die. Elsewhere in this letter, he expressed the hope that he would survive. For example, in Philippians chapter 1, verse 25, he wrote, "I know that I will remain," indicating an expectation that he would live to continue ministering to the Philippians. Paul was not absolutely sure what would happen to him. On the one hand, he knew that his death was a real possibility, and so he tried to prepare his friends in Philippi for the worst. On the other hand, he had some level of expectation that he would survive, and so he encouraged them to hope for the best. But whatever the future held for him, at the time he wrote this letter, he was suffering greatly, so that he struggled with sorrow and apprehension. Having looked at Paul's relationship with the Philippians and his suffering in prison, we should now explore the conditions that existed in Philippi at the time of Paul's letter to them. What circumstances did they face that required Paul's attention and exhortation? Paul addressed many conditions in the church in Philippi, but we will focus on just two matters: the Philippian church's concern for Paul and the internal and external problems that existed for the church in Philippi. Let's begin by mentioning the Philippians' concern for Paul. As a whole, the church in Philippi had a strong, loving relationship with the Apostle Paul. And when they heard about his sufferings in prison, they were dismayed and worried about him. So as soon as they were able, they demonstrated their concern by sending a gift to meet Paul's earthly needs and by dispatching Epaphroditus to deliver the gift to Paul and to minister to him in prison. Paul mentioned this gift in Philippians chapter 4, verse 18, writing this note of thanks: "I have received full payment and even more. I am amply supplied now that I have received from Epaphroditus the gifts you sent. They are a fragrant offering, an acceptable sacrifice, pleasing to God." As we have mentioned, the Philippians were not wealthy, so this gift constituted a significant sacrifice on their part. But they sent it eagerly because they were so concerned about Paul's well-being. And as we read in Philippians chapter 2, verse 25, the Philippian church also sent Epaphroditus to minister to Paul in prison. Listen to Paul's words there. "It is necessary to send back to you Epaphroditus, who is also your messenger, whom you sent to take care of my needs." Apparently, Epaphroditus also delivered a report to Paul expressing the Philippians' fears that Paul was being persecuted by other believers and that a threat of death hung over his head. And in his letter to them, Paul confirmed that the Philippians had properly understood his circumstances, and he expressed appreciation for their concern. For example, in Philippians chapter 1, verses 15 through 17, he admitted that certain preachers of the gospel were troubling him. He described his situation with these words: "Some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains." In fact, one of the reasons Paul felt so sorrowful was that so few of the believers around him, including Christian leaders, truly dedicated their hearts to gospel ministry. Listen to his words to this effect in Philippians chapter 2, verse 21. Everyone looks out for his own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. In short, the Philippians were justified in their concern for Paul at this time. Paul's troubles were great, and his support was thin. But the Philippians weren't simply concerned about the fact that Paul was suffering. They were also worried that he might die, whether through assassination or public execution. And these fears were justified. As we have seen in prior lessons, the Jews had attempted to assassinate Paul more than once, and the crime of which he was accused was punishable by death. So out of deep concern for the apostle, the Philippians devoted themselves to prayer on Paul's behalf. Paul thanked them for their prayers in Philippians chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, with these words of encouragement. I know that through your prayers and the help given by the Spirit of Jesus Christ, what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. I eagerly expect and hope that Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. Paul was grateful for the Philippians' prayers, and he assured them that even death would be a welcome form of deliverance from his suffering. Having considered the Philippians' concern for Paul's well-being, we should now look at some of the problems that existed for the church there, stemming from a variety of sources. The church in Philippi faced at least three types of problems. First, they appear to have faced persecution from those outside the church. Second, they were threatened by the possibility of false teaching similar to that which had infiltrated other churches. And third, they struggled with conflicts between one another in the church. Paul mentioned the persecution they were undergoing in Philippians chapter 1, verses 27 through 30, writing these words, Stand firm in one spirit, contending as one man for the faith of the gospel without being frightened in any way by those who oppose you. For it has been granted to you on behalf of Christ to suffer for him, since you are going through the same struggle you saw I had, and now hear that I still have. Some years earlier, just after he had planted the church in Philippi, Paul had encountered great resistance from Jews in the neighboring Macedonian city of Thessalonica. And as we read in Acts chapter 17, verses 5 through 13, these angry Jews accused Paul and the other believers of violating Roman law. As a result, Paul was forced to flee the city by night to avoid further persecution by Jews, as well as arrest by the civil government. These Thessalonian Jews were so zealous that they pursued Paul even to the city of Berea. So it is reasonable to think that these same Jews, or others like them, also troubled the church in Philippi and perhaps roused the local government against the church as well. But whatever the specific nature of the persecution in Philippi, it is at least clear that the church was truly suffering at the hands of unbelievers. A second problem faced by the Philippian church was the threat of false teaching. Now, it appears that false teaching had not yet deeply influenced the church in Philippi, since Paul did not confront it directly. But he did prepare the Philippians to reject any false teaching that might reach their city. Consider Paul's words about circumcision in Philippians chapter 3, verses 1 through 3. It is no trouble for me to write the same things to you again, and it is a safeguard for you. Watch out for those dogs, those men who do evil, those mutilators of the flesh, for it is we who are the circumcision. Paul was concerned that false teachers who advocated abuses of circumcision might trouble the Philippian church. He also condemned false teaching in Philippians chapter 3, verses 18 and 19. Many live as enemies of the cross of Christ. Their destiny is destruction, their God is their stomach, and their glory is in their shame. Their mind is on earthly things. Paul's language here might describe any number of false teachings, including such things as dietary asceticism and improper use of Old Testament dietary laws. Now, these types of false teachings might have come from two sources. On the one hand, Paul may have been concerned about the heresies that had threatened the churches in Colossae and the other cities of the Lycus Valley. As we mentioned in a prior lesson, these false teachings in the Lycus Valley combined Christian teachings with elements from Greek philosophy, asceticism, and corruptions of Jewish law. For example, Paul specifically associated this false teaching with an abusive use of circumcision in Colossians chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, as well as with dietary asceticism in Colossians chapter 2, verses 20 through 23. On the other hand, he may have been worried about Christian Judaizers from Jerusalem, such as those he had written against long ago in Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 through 21, and more recently in Romans chapter 4, verses 9 through 17. It is possible that he also ran into conflict with them during the trip to Jerusalem that resulted in his present imprisonment. Like the false teachers in the Lycus Valley, the Judaizers also abused circumcision and diet, forcing Gentile believers to adhere to outmoded forms of adherence to the Old Testament law. Lastly, besides troubles with persecution and false teaching, the Philippians struggled with conflicts among believers within the church. Paul addressed these conflicts in general terms in Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, with this exhortation: If you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from His love, if any fellowship with the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, be like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and purpose. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. And in Philippians chapter 4, verse 2, he exhorted two women who seemed to have been unable to resolve their differences, writing these words: I plead with Euodia and I plead with Syntyche to agree with each other in the Lord. Now, the internal conflicts in Philippi did not warrant harsh discipline. Still, they were disruptive, unproductive, and sinful. Self-centered, unloving conflict is never acceptable in the church. So Paul spent a substantial amount of space emphasizing the importance of unity and love in the church.